This is kind of circumspect, but you don't really know how important what you do for somebody is. A lot of times there's things you'll do and somebody might never express how much it means to them what happened. I had friends who, I don't see anymore. They moved across the country and whatnot. Um, but when I was really isolated, they still hung out with me. And they picked me up, took me to go get bubble tea, you know, every couple weeks, you know? And it's like, eh, you know, it, when you're feeling really isolated and you've lost most of your friends and everybody else has kind of moved on from college and, you still get that phone call, you know, I never really had the words to explain how much it meant to me. I didn't even really realize it was just like, oh, okay, we're going out, we're getting bubble tea again. It's our thing. But it's like in hindsight, it's like that was one of my only connections for like a year and a half was doing that.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with an interview about schizoaffective disorder. Um, so I just kind of wanted to start by asking our guest whether you'd be willing to share, to whatever extent you're comfortable, about your mental health diagnoses and how experiencing trauma has influenced your mental health.
Um, so I have a number of diagnoses that I've had throughout the years. I've had depression. Um, I've had self-harm, I've had homicidal ideation, suicidal ideation, I've had a diagnosis of PTSD, as well as schizoaffective bipolar type. So trauma has played a pretty pivotal role in all of those experiences that led to mental illness. I was molested as a child. Before I became schizoaffective, I experienced sexual trauma from a partner. Um, and, you know, one thing, one thing that I've been thinking about recently, when I reread these questions, um, individuals, life is very complicated. You know, there's times where individuals, that partner that sexually assaulted me and did other things, they were a good person. They would go out of their way to help anybody. And they were acting from trauma themselves. And, as we were each other's first real relationship, and, you know, if somebody who is that kind, which I know they are, could act that way, it really makes things complicated and confusing because you can be really angry at somebody, you know, and you can still know they're a good person and love them, but they've really, really harmed you. And I mean that's a pretty drastic situation.
No, thank you very much. I'm sorry the audio is cutting out at points, but I think I caught most of that. Yeah, I definitely agree that trauma is a very nuanced topic, and the um, I think sometimes people can have a very traumatic impact on others, but that isn't necessarily their intention, as you highlighted. I think in some cases, the impact on people is still so severe, especially for children, that they need to be removed from the situation to be protected. But sometimes, like in the healing process, it can be helpful to. Um, like this is maybe a bit tangential, but I know some people. I think like in therapy, sometimes there's an exercise where people almost build like a family tree and kind of like map different characteristics or experiences, and sometimes for people it can give them a broader understanding of or like context of the environment that they grew up in. So that kind
Yeah.
of came to mind a little bit as you were talking. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing your experiences and thoughts. The next question is kind of about when did you first begin experiencing symptoms or traits of schizoaffective disorder, and what was that experience like for you?
So I remember the very moment I started experiencing schizoaffective, in psychotic, what is the term? Florid psychoses. It was the night of May 9th, and I believe it was 2011. I heard in my head, "Welcome to the Boneyard," and it was terrifying. Um, there are a lot of things that I experienced which were either false memories or hallucinatory eruptions from my unconscious that I unconsciously acted out. You know, I have a memory of waking up and seeing a bruise on my cheek in the mirror. Later that day, I was in a gas station and I kept trying to take cigarettes and I would get yelled at and I'd give them back. I was trying to buy cigarettes, but I was so completely incomprehensible to myself and other people, that, they ended up calling the cops. I tried to go behind the counter. I ended up getting punched by the clerk. But, it, you know, it, it's terrifying when you have an experience where you have a memory of being punched, or rather, you have a memory of seeing a bruise before something happened and then it happened, whether it was, unconsciously acting out something from the unconscious or a false memory. Um, but things like that, when you experience weird things like that with schizoaffective, it becomes very difficult to parse apart reality because time stops making sense. Um, and then, I mean, your cause and effect and all the systems that you can equilibrate yourself and navigate reality in go out the window when things like that start happening. So, and to this day, I really don't know what that was, whether it was a false memory or some weird hallucination that I was compelled to act out throughout the day or what. But it was pretty terrifying. I spent, quite a bit of time after that, burning myself and hitting my head against walls and cutting myself, having hallucinations that I was being terrorized and raped by demons. I would go to bed and you know, I would have hallucinations that I was on a pyre going down, this stone archway, or I was on a boat that was a pyre that was floating down this river underneath a stone archway going to hell. And I mean, that was what it was like going to bed for months, just being terrified with these voices and these figures and these strange images going on. You know, um, so that was horrible. Um, and, I really, it didn't really get much better. I mean, it didn't really get much better until a couple of years after I started experiencing psychoses. I was in the mental health hospital again, and my mother told me she wasn't going to sign me out unless I promised to take medication. So I started taking medication, which, had a lot of hurdles and obstacles that came along with that, but it was better. I stopped self harming. The hallucinations quieted down to some extent. Um, with medication, I mean, there's all sorts of side effects. Sleeping literally 20 hours a day at the beginning, when I was on Haldol. Um, weight gain, I gained 80 pounds in 8 months. Um, I did start going to a CMH, seeing a therapist, which started the process of unpacking, my psychological history and interconnections to myself, intra connections. You know, Um, but yeah, it's really terrifying when, you know, I mean, we kind of have this conscious experience of reality. You know, we trust we can see, feel, touch, hear things, and they're real. Um, but when that process, when the, when the instrument or whatever you want to call it, when the organ, the brain, that is responsible for, you know, processing and representing those things into consciousness is disrupted. Um, it's terrifying. You know, you end up with all sorts of strange conclusions about reality, and it's really isolating because, well, a lot of those thoughts are terrifying thoughts, delusions about, the government or demons or religion or, just very strange things. So you're isolated because you're delusional, so you really believe these things. No one else believes them because they're absolutely off the wall. Um, and so, it's really frustrating because you're really trying to do your best, but you can't come to any other conclusion because your experience has become faulty. So it makes it so it's like, I don't know. It's really difficult because, you know, to some extent, no matter how much you do, you know, there can always be that disruption there. Um, I don't want to discount therapy, but I recently started a new med, Cobenfy, which has made it very, very apparent to me that, I have a lifelong chronic brain disorder. um, and that trying to cure myself through, the keto diet and, neural inflammation or, you know, long-term fasting and just there's a lot of on the fringe things or taking giant doses of turmeric or, just there's a lot of things that are marginally helpful that people go down these rabbit holes to try and fix themselves without medication. And unfortunately, 99.99999% of people, and I say that with just the hesitation that there could be some random fluke. You're not really going to heal from, these processes, Um, and maybe if you could have some strict situation where somebody else, could strictly monitor all your food, all your nutrition, all these things all the time. And it's not feasible for anyone to be able to keep up, to afford or to keep up the level of discipline to, function on these diets and these nutritional regimes or these fasting regimes, Um, so, it's made it very aware that, I have a chronic brain disorder that is, a disruption in both the structure and the neurochemistry of the brain, which is actually really relieving. Full circle back to what's it like experiencing the beginning of psychosis, coming around out of that delusion that you did something horrible to anger God, to trying to fix your brain through holistic alternative medicine, to no, there's it simply is a matter of fact, like your brain has some difficulties.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that answer and for describing, I think, so vividly what it's like when it started and how distressing that must have been. And I'm sorry that you experienced that. And I can also kind of understand a little bit how it must be, in some ways, a relief to, understanding that there's sort of a imbalance in the brain that is causing it rather than feeling like sort of personal responsibility to try and change something which isn't possible to change with a medication.
And
Um,
that's the thing too, right? It's impossible to change. And it, sorry to tangent for a
no,
second, but
please, yeah.
it's a lot better to it's a lot better realizing, your brain's messed up than like some weird delusion. Like this was something I had recently, last time I was hospitalized, that like Anubis was coming in a stone sphinx ship to unbury a saber that had killed Socrates and was going to start splitting humans in half using this sword because it's actually liquid metal. And the reason he was being sent was because he was, God said magisterium, meaning like mystery, and evil became into existence due to curiosity of God saying, what is mystery, and created these and Egyptians, they were projected as Egyptian, but these like molten metal plasma gods on the star Sirius, and that's where Anubis was coming from. And just like in that, Solomon, when Magisterium was said, was transported to there, and these molten metal gods started dissecting, Solomon in the past as a child. And that's where that biblical story of split the child came from. And like, and it was because molten metal doesn't feel emotions, and they're just trying to understand with this drive, like this pathological scientific drive. It's really nice to know that none of this crazy, bizarre, horrifying stuff is real. Sorry to tangent on that. I don't know if that's important to anyone to hear, but bizarre stuff you can think.
No, thank you. The kind of one question I have is also, were you able to receive a diagnosis of schizoaffective pretty quickly, or was there a delay? Did you kind of experience any misdiagnoses prior to that?
So I got a diagnosis relatively fast, probably within 5 to 6 months. Um, I didn't accept the diagnosis probably for another year and a half. Um, that was really hard. Um, The first time I was told I was mentally ill, I went rigid, rolled out of the chair I was sitting in, landed on the ground face first, and had to be carried to. I was in the psych ward. I had to be carried to my room and laid in bed, and I was catatonic, so I didn't move for a couple days and just sat, not sat, but laid there staring at the ceiling for like 2 days. Um, so yeah, I did get a diagnosis relatively fast, and I even got a medication that would have been very good that I was on for a number of years. Um, so that the doctors that I saw were really good about that.
I'm glad that you were able to get the diagnosis fairly quickly. One other question is, are there any resources that you wish you had growing up in terms of, I guess, just mental health support, or anything that would have helped you with self-understanding? And I have kind of a tangentially related question to this. That's also, if you could go back in time and give yourself advice about mental health or well-being, what would it be?
Trust people. If I could have done one thing differently, I would have opened up. Um, I was scared and sad and lonely, and I didn't really trust anyone. I didn't trust my family, my friends, my teachers, anyone, my coaches, no one. Um, life would have taken a very different trajectory. I think I could have ended up, getting real therapeutic help at a young age, which would have mitigated a lot of problems. Um, could have saved me, if I did go to a therapist for depression and self harm in eighth grade. But we never really delved into any of the issues. And, you know, part of that is I just never opened up, you know? I just stonewalled the therapist for months and months and months until it was like, well, there's really no point in, doing this because, I refused to talk about anything, unfortunately. That led to a lot of, issues. Like, I mean, that could have saved me from the anorexia and bulimia and the drug addiction and maybe even the schizoaffective, development. Um, so yeah, if there's one thing I could have done differently, it would have been trust people and open up. Um, and that's a lot easier said than done. Because I experienced some terrifying things when I was young. I mean, in middle school, um, I became really depressed. I started reading horrible stuff like Edgar Allan Poe and, getting into, some really dark poetry. And, you know, that's one thing. It's kind of odd that you would have Edgar Allan Poe like in an eighth grade classroom for a free read. I don't know. I don't think that's really very
Yeah.
appropriate. Um, but I read those things and I'm in a really depressed state and I started having homicidal and suicidal ideation. I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, that's terrifying to me, having a thought like, you have a thought kill someone. I mean, people don't people are terrified of thoughts like that, and you know, also like how do you broach that subject with someone like, I had a thought to kill myself or to kill somebody, that I saw walking down the street. Like, people are terrified of things like that, and rightfully so. I mean, those are scary thoughts. Um, but that being said, you know, opening up and having that courage, and I guess point being about, rightfully so, you need to be able to open up to people that you can be safe with, and maybe that isn't your family, maybe that isn't, one of your peers, one of your friends, but a student counselor, um, a teacher. And if you can open up to your friends and family, that's a great thing too. Um, because having those ideations, I ended up turning it all against myself. And, I started cutting myself that year. I spent months, whenever I took showers, I'd get out razors and I'd cut myself and, rub shampoo and stuff into it to make it hurt more. Um, I mean, and, if at any point during that time I had opened up and been like, I'm terrified, what is happening to me? You know, if I had opened up to that therapist that I went to, you know, I, I can't imagine how much better my life would be in the past, the different trajectory it would have went on. Um, so I mean, if there's one thing that I could say to do differently is to really have that courage to open up to somebody that can help you. And as a kid, that really does mean you got to open up to an adult because, just friends, they can be really concerned and they can try and support you. But if you're somebody who's having, mental illness, you really need the help of an adult to get to a therapist to really get the help you need.
Yeah. As you said, I think it's really understandable why it was hard for you to trust people given all of the really challenging experiences that you had. But that advice does make sense, and that ultimately I think some degree of trust is often required to kind of access the connection and support that is needed to heal. The next question is, what led you to become interested in supporting other people? I know that you've worked in peer support, which I think is wonderful. And what did you most enjoy about working as a peer support specialist?
Um, you know, really just wanting to help people. Um, I had been doing a lot better in my life. I'd been, medicated. I stopped smoking cigarettes. And I took a class for DBT at a CMH, and the lead peer at that CMH had talked to me about being a peer support during that. And this was years after that I finally, stopped doing drugs and got my life together to the point where I could actually do that. So I really wanted to help people. Um, And the thing I enjoyed the most was just the one-on-one interactions. I worked on an ACT team. So that's assertive community treatment. So I would go meet people out in the community. So I had the opportunity, I could go, take someone and go get a milkshake, or, go play chess and have coffee at a cafe, or, just go drive around or go for a walk. There was a lot of freedom in what I could do with clients. And so just the opportunity to get to know people. I mean, medication is really important and things like that, but really just having a personal connection with someone means so much. I've been on both sides of, getting treatment and helping people, and just personal connection means so much to both sides. And it's not just peer support, I mean, the people I worked with, the counselors and, social workers and nurses, I mean, they're in the field as well for that same reason, for that connection and helping people. Um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that the people you worked with probably also really appreciated that connection, especially from someone who, even though you probably don't have exactly the same experience, but to have some degree of shared understanding, I imagine would feel really supportive. Um, and then, kind of as a sub question under this, are there any common themes or shared experiences that you found among people you've worked with? I know each person will be, an individual, but are there pretty general themes that have emerged?
Isolation is a huge one. Individuals with, mental illness often are very isolated. Um, you know, so I mean, yeah. And along with that is, being seen, really having someone who sits down and listens to you, and not just, like, okay, what are we doing? Let's get that, but really just sitting down and spending time with you. Um, because I think a lot of, the delusions and the difficulty with stuff like that, um, you know, you don't have a lot of situations where you have a lot of trust built up, when you have a lot of mental illness, because you most likely have trauma in your past, which is pretty important for developing, most mental illness. So trust is already compromised. And so you really don't have anyone that you can have a reciprocal relationship where you can be genuinely yourself. Um, and so without that, I mean, that makes, existing just really hard. Um, I'm sorry, I lost, what was the question again?
No, I mean, I think you're addressing it really well about kind of the theme of isolation. It was about whether there's other sort of common themes that have emerged
Oh,
in your work with people.
also, another really common theme is just drug addiction. Um, Unfortunately, almost everybody I've worked with, including myself, as well as people I've known who struggle with mental illness, also struggle severely with drug addiction, or at least have at some point in their life. Um, I mean, and you know, there's so much, damage to the brain could be averted if drug abuse didn't go on. And I mean, unfortunately, I was severely, I mean, compared to some people, maybe not, but I was pretty severely drug addicted, for a decade, using drugs almost on a daily basis. Um, and I did not have it nearly as bad as a lot of people. Be individuals who get disability, but you literally walk outside the shelter and somebody is selling drugs. I mean, and you feel horrible. Your medication makes you feel horrible. You have no prospect of a job. You have no prospect of basically, you know, any real positive momentum in your life. So you reach out to drugs and they're right there, you know, and the cops, I never saw a cop, you know, sweep outside that building. You know, the people that worked at the shelter, they're not going to go pick a fight with a drug dealer that sits out there. I mean, that's dangerous, you know? And it might not just be dangerous to them, but for their other people staying at the shelter, they might retaliate. You know, you don't know. Um, so, I mean, drug addiction, you know, is really common among people that are pretty severely mentally ill. Um, and unfortunately, I mean, unfortunately, you know, with the shutting down of mental health institutions, well, asylums, um, that paved the way for the drug addiction with mentally ill. I mean, those asylums should have been, you know, fixed. They should have been, I mean, they definitely needed to be renovated and fixed and redone and, you know, all those things. But it's kind of, you know, a perfect storm where, you know, some people said, well, look at this situation. Why are we spending money on this? These are horrible conditions. They're not humanitarian conditions. So we shouldn't be supporting this. And other people said, you know, well, the mentally ill just experience reality in a different way. And who are we to say it's wrong and put them in an institution? You know, both people having points, but both missing the mark.
What advice do you have for other peer support specialists or just clinicians in general to use a trauma-informed approach, especially given that so many people with mental health conditions or substance dependency probably experience quite a bit of trauma? And what factors help you feel most comfortable in a clinical environment?
Actually, a couple things. For one, you know, you're going to run into situations where people are going to say things and you're just going to be like, I don't believe that. You know, it's okay. Those are, you know, those are not a reflection of your real views, but you can have those thoughts where it's like, I don't know about that. And you can worry about there being like some mismatch in, you know, the flow of interaction or, you know, that, you know, oh no, they might read into that or, you know, I don't know. Like, I would say worry less about yourself in those situations and your in the moment responses and just try and be as present as you can, you know, and listen. Because in a situation with trauma, you know, especially, you know, someone who's experienced all sorts of delusions and hallucinations, it's less important, you know, in certain situations, whether something factually happened, but sitting there and being present with somebody while they talk about something that was emotionally or physically traumatic to them, you know, and just letting them know you're listening, um, and being honest with them, you know, and you know, I mean, obviously you have to calibrate that with certain situations. I mean, it might be a situation where you can't be like, you know, that sounds off the wall, you know, where you got to be more, you know, delicate in the situation, but you know, being honest, you know, because, you know, you can tell when a clinician is not being honest with you, or you can tell, you know, when you're, you know, working with a client and you kind of say what you mean, but you kind of don't. You can see it in the client that they recognize you're not being honest with them. Um, and that's really important, you know, and having difficult conversations with people, you know, that's how you build that, you know, the term therapeutic alliance, right? That's how you build that ability and connection where you can actually dig through difficult things together. So, I mean, honesty is fundamental. Um, and and I don't know, like this is like I just woo, I have this, moment in me where I'm like, clinicians will never understand, because on a certain level, like, you're sitting there and you're talking to this person, and I don't know, maybe they have some depression or, something, or maybe they get mania a few times in their life, but they don't have like severe depression or severe mania, right? Like, you know, and maybe there are some, but I would say, I think the vast majority of people that, are in, clinical roles have their life pretty well together. And so there's always this feeling, on the other side where it's like, you just don't get it, like you've never had a delusion or a hallucination. Like you've never, you've never walked into a gas station, was convinced that somebody was talking about you, and went up to the counter to buy cigarettes and started stammering and stuttering, and your whole body was shuddering because you were so nervous because somebody was talking about you when they weren't talking about you. But like, you're in such a state where you can't even talk because you're that frightened of the world and social interaction or just being in public and around people. And it's like, I don't know. It so I guess I don't know. I guess what would I tell a clinician in that situation? Try less to understand it through academics. In situations like that, don't try to say, oh, that's a delusion. Oh, that's, nervousness. Your stress is up. Just be there as a person. Like, what would you say if something like really embarrassing happened to your good friend, when they were out in public? Like, treat it like that, like be there as a person for another person. Because, ultimately, having it explained in diagnostic terms doesn't really help. Um, and and it can go a long way to opening up a mirror neurons, opening up an interaction where you can have a genuinely, and genuine is not the right word, but an opening up of experience of not just cognitive empathy, but embodied empathy, where you may be able to feel and experience the emotions that that person went through, in the terror and the fright and the confusion, and be able to put yourself in their place if you go about that interaction that way, instead of putting it through a lens of this type of psychological thinking, the Jungian, or the or the cognitive behavioral. No, just be there as a person and be present and allow yourself to feel what they're feeling, because sometimes like, yeah, I mean, it's not, it's not, in a situation like that, it's not whether or not a clinician ever heard a voice. It's, the important thing is, can you understand what I experienced because I heard the voice? Like what I went through because the voice, not the voice in and of itself.
Yeah. It, sorry, if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of like the emotional empathy of it rather than sort of trying to connect it to a personal understanding or see it through like the closest related experience that they've had. Um,
I mean, I think it's emotion is part of it. I think it's more experiential empathy,
mm,
feeling into the experience of what happened. Emotions are definitely part of it. But the thought process that went into it, in just, actually experiencing what it would be like for somebody going through something that disruptive and terrifying. And maybe that is what, you know, um, emotional empathy means. I don't know. I'm not
I don't
familiar
know if
with
it's
that
even a
specific
term, it
term.
just be yeah, it might not even be a proper term. Yeah, it's just the phrasing that came to mind. But yeah, thank you very much for that answer. I think it's really insightful. And then ironically, the next question on the list is one that's a little bit more uh academic and in an area that I think you have quite a bit of academic experience on. Which is, I guess, firstly, what has been your personal experience with Cobenfy? And then also, why does Cobenfy have potentially reduced? Obviously, it's going to be different from individual to individual, but what's your understanding of why it might have potentially reduced side effects compared to atypical antipsychotics?
So my experience with Cobenfy has been pretty amazing. Um, well, I'll say this as a caveat. I had some pretty bad GI issues for a couple days. I was very constipated, felt very nauseous for a couple days, but it cleared up really quickly. And from what I heard, almost all side effects resolve themselves within 2 weeks. Um, in the long-term studies that they did, I this is what I heard. My aunt read these studies and looked into it. That's actually why I got on Cobenfy, because my aunt told me about it. Um, but she said that nobody actually dropped out of the long-term studies due to the side effects, and that they resolved, within 2 weeks, which is really exciting. And so I guess the biggest thing can come back to the side effects in a moment. But the biggest thing with the Cobenfy is it's given me an opportunity where my emotions and my cognition and my behavior are starting to integrate again into a cohesive whole. Um, Carl Jung, I believe it was Carl Jung who said this, that when he was describing schizophrenia, it was as if the ego had been so disrupted or wounded or disintegrated that the unconscious would chaotically erupt with, hallucinations and images and delusions. Um, and, a lot of people talk about, egoism being a bad thing. Jung just meant ego as in the conscious function of our psyche. Like right now, we're talking, having a conversation, we're, embodied in our ego, our conscious state. So, um, you know, part of that ego state is a cohesion between the different parts of us, whether it's our emotions or our senses, our ability to smell and see, or our memories, or our fear response, or, our ability to think logically or plan ahead, or, you know, coordinate our body and our motor skills, or, all these things start to come into disharmony with schizophrenia or schizoaffective. Um, and, you know, definitely in other mental illnesses as well. But I mean, I can really speak to schizoaffective where, you know, your ability to, and it's funny because I'm saying your ability to, as if it's something that like you consciously control. That's something that's become, very apparent with the Cobenfy. Um, the thing that we call, volition, willed action, making our choices and things like that. There's there is a level where those things are very relevant, but you have to have the different capacities in your psyche and, subsequently, or not subsequently, but substratally, your brain function working cohesively to make it so you can actually have a volition. When your emotions and your thinking and your behavior don't work together, I mean, it's maddening because you can watch other people, that are really good people, and you can ask them for their help and be like, what do I get this to work? Get my brain to work. And it's like they can give you the best advice and things that work for them. And they can give you advice, whether it's from philosophy or religion or, wherever that has worked for thousands of years and for millions of people, but it's not going to work for you because that's disrupted, you know? Um, and Cobenfy for me really put that together, um, which has been a blessing. Um, I'm not saying that therapy, doesn't, have its place because I experienced a lot of rapid integration when I started taking Cobenfy. It was as if, the 7, 8 years of therapy actually was like uploaded to the computer terminal finally. It was kind of a very strange experience. So I mean therapy is really important too, but having the right medication that allows your conscious experience to function, harmoniously is really important. And for me, Cobenfy did that. Um, and one of the things that relates to side effects and disruption of, your being, um, on a lot of medications, atypicals and neuroleptics, you're going to be ravenously hungry. Um, excuse me. Um, your hunger hormones get disrupted and, you know, you end up gaining huge amounts of weight, which, you know, it'd be one thing if it was, 10, 20 pounds. I gained 80 pounds in 8 months. Um, and for somebody who fought with anorexia and bulimia for many, for, pretty severely for about 2 years and had issues with it for years and years. Um, getting that under control and having a healthy relationship and then having that disrupted, where you're can't stop eating and you eat to the point where you're start vomiting again. I mean, that was something, about 2, 3 years ago. I was on olanzapine at 25 milligrams daily, and I ended up starting to decrease it because I couldn't stop eating. And I started binging every single night until I felt sick. And then I started vomiting again because I couldn't sleep because I felt horribly, bloated and just stuffed and sick. And it was just this vicious cycle where, it's like, I mean, it's like, it was maddening because it didn't matter, like I lost weight, during that period. But the thing is, I walked anywhere from 8 to I think the most I walked one day was 16 miles. But I consistently put in 8 miles a day, and I was eating almost all veggies and lean meat. And so, it's like it's miserable when you're just to lose some weight, you end up spending all day, cooking and exercising. It's not sustainable, nor is it a very happy existence, but you're worried, right? Like, you have a situation, when you're schizoaffective, schizophrenic, like, there's a huge increase in, you know, in being obese and having issues with cholesterol and heart attacks and, you know, in developing diabetes, all these things that shorten your life, and it just, so I mean that's a concern. But with Cobenfy, you don't got to worry about that. Because Cobenfy doesn't mess with your hunger hormones, which is awesome. And so it's kind of interesting. Um, older antipsychotics worked on the dopamine system directly, D2 antagonism, and um, so Cobenfy actually works on M1 and M4. Those are muscarinic or G-coupled protein receptors that are acetylcholinergic. And what they do is they actually regulate different dopamine circuits in the striatum. So instead of just blanket blocking D2 receptors with dopamine, um, you know, and I don't think, this has worked out really, but in this maybe is going to go a long way to working that out, but it causes certain regulations of those striatum dopaminergic circuits at a level that's abstracted from dopamine receptor regulation. And I don't know if the studies have been done. I'm sure they have because I skimmed looking. Um, but I don't know exactly, like what is the muscarinic doing in the striatum that is different, like why would there be like why could there be cohesion between emotions and motivation, as a result, what circuits are responsible for that? I don't know that level of detail. Um, but that's something that they're probably mapping out with, Cobenfy now. And also a side note too, with Cobenfy, um, having antipsychotics that work on muscarinic receptors is probably going to be a new, a whole new class of drugs. I know that UCSD has studies going on for a M4 allosteric agonist, another antipsychotic that acts on the muscarinic system in the brain. And it's in stage 2 trials right now, and they're doing clinical trials. They're recruiting people for studies right now. So, I mean, it looks like, that as a therapeutic target is going to be, hopefully it's going to be a whole new class of antipsychotics that don't have nearly the issues with the eating. Um, and from my experience, it's better at treating delusions as well as cognition. Um, yeah. So, I mean, I couldn't recommend Cobenfy enough.
Uh, thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear that you've had a, a great experience on Cobenfy and that you haven't had, I guess, some of the more distressing side effects as compared to other antipsychotics. Um, and the next question is a little bit of a jump in topic, but what mental health resources would you like to see made available to people in kind of an ideal world with unlimited resources? And then kind of the sub questions I read along with that is, would you be willing to share your perspective on why individuals with more significant or profound mental health conditions often end up being seen in community mental health? And are there kind of resources or extensions of community mental health that you think would help individuals receive higher quality of care? So that's kind of like an umbrella of several questions. But yeah, anything.
Um, um, I mean, in an idealized world, actually, this is kind of funny. Uh, I, you know, the term, I don't know if you ever heard, like out to the funny farm or whatever, the funny farm.
No, I haven't.
Maybe it's an older term. I mean, you know, I don't know. It probably was used disparagingly at times. I mean, the way it's kind of a glib statement. But what it actually reflected on, um, you know, this is something my dad told me. In the past, not even that long ago, maybe 80 years, you know, it was really common for people that were mentally ill to be able to go live on farms, and take care of animals and take care of plants. And it was just a common cultural thing, that was present, at least in the US, and I'm sure other places, where, individuals that, were really suffering could go and live a more peaceful life on farms. So, you know, not not the best introduction to the idea. I don't know. I thought it was just because I don't know. I'd always heard the comment of like, somebody out to the funny farm and like anachronistic literature or TV. And it was always like, oh, okay, they're saying somebody's kind of crazy or loopy, but then finding out that like, no, this was actually like the cultural respect for individuals that were experiencing mental illness was, it was common that they were accommodated to the extent where they could go live on farms and have a meaningful life. Because, in an ideal world, everybody does something to contribute. I mean, that that's something that, working as a peer support, became very apparent. That was the first job I ever held down for an appreciable amount of time. And first job I really ever cared about. And so doing meaningful work, whether or not, you're healthy or not, or, I mean, it's really important for self-worth and motivation and just, connection to people. And so, yeah, in an idealized world, individuals that are suffering would be able to find ways to contribute to the world. And, I think that go a long way to helping things like addiction. I mean, in a practical sense, if you're working, you don't have time to sit around and be high. But in a more important sense, I mean, you use drugs to fill a void, and that void is, connection to people. And so, if you could have something meaningful to do, to contribute to a cause that you believe in or help a group of people, or, and it doesn't even have to be, doesn't even have to be that. Like maybe you like baking bread, so you make bread, or you like coffee, so you serve coffee, you know? But having a way to contribute, you know? So in an ideal, yeah, I guess that'd be a big thing for an ideal situation. Could you do the latter part of the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. So the latter part is basically whether you see a need for kind of extensions of community mental health or adding resources to community mental health that would help
Um,
achieve higher
oh,
quality.
I really think, and maybe this isn't quite extension, but um, something that I ran into, as a peer support, um, you know, it was policy that you were not friends with the clients you're working with. And I guess to me, I considered the clients that I worked with friends. I saw them, almost every week or at least every other week. I spent hours with them, socializing, talking, and you know, just getting to know them. And so I think, you know, in CMH where there's a reflection that, yeah, like you're going to develop friendships with the clients. Mental health is not this like sterile thing. It's not like, it's not like putting together an engine where you have pieces and parts that are inert. To have a good relationship in mental health, you're going to have a genuine relationship with people. So I think just, having the awareness in CMH that, you're going to have genuine social and even friendships, connections with people, and actually even leaning into that, I think emphasizing that would be a really helpful thing, you know? Uh, yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting topic. Yeah, sort of balancing like the human connection with boundaries and mental health is one of my own personal like areas of intense interest, and I think it's definitely. I imagine that for peer support in particular, people might be looking more for the human connection in it, and sometimes, and I don't know exactly like where the ideal balance lies, but I imagine that sometimes an overly detached or clinical approach could be, or like overly sterile, as you mentioned, like might not be the most supportive thing for people.
Well, I mean,
Definitely
if I can
yeah.
like flesh it out a little bit more, like
Mm,
even in situations where it's like a psychiatrist. I had a situation where I was, you know, so I was on an ECT team. So we had, this team where we would go and see about 90 clients a week and we would rotate who saw who, but everybody, all 90 of our clients were seen at least once a week by people. We managed medications, taking them to doctor's appointments, just checking in to see how they were doing. Some of the clinicians did therapy with people. um, and then there was a psychiatrist and some other prescribers, nurse practitioners, I believe that's what they were. Um, they would meet, clients from all the teams. Um, and so, the reason I single out the psychiatrist is it's about the psychiatrist. But the interaction I had with the psychiatrist makes me believe that the client was speaking the truth because in a progress note before he met with them, I made a mention that he had some fears and reservations meeting with the psychiatrist. I didn't go into any detail of what he said. And I brought it up to the psychiatrist the day before the meeting just to, air his, feelings. So, there weren't, any undercurrent, undertows. And the psychiatrist's immediate reaction, he didn't even listen and hear me out. It was, oh, he's just delusional, you know? Um, and and on top of that, my coworker, who's a social worker, was in the office when that situation happened, and she agreed that what the client said was accurate. So I mean, like yeah, there is something to be said about clinical detachment, but when clinical detachment makes it so you can, just deflect poor behavior, that is uninsightful as somebody's symptomology. I mean that's a breakdown in the medical relationship, the therapeutic relationship.
oh, absolutely. Yeah. Especially if it's kind of used to almost dismiss the needs of a client or patient because they're labeled as having a certain mental health condition. So yeah, I really appreciate that point. The next question is, what advice do you have for people who are supporting a friend or a loved one who has mental health conditions?
Um, and it really kept me going, you know. Um, so I guess really, you know, and and that can be a hard thing if you never hear that from somebody. But it's like, yeah, like sometimes I don't know. Don't second guess yourself whether it's worth it or whether or not you helped somebody. Because if you put in some time, it was worth it and they really appreciate it. Even if they never know how to express it, it's made a difference.
Yeah, that's a beautiful piece of advice. Yeah, thank you so much. Um, the the next question is, I guess I was just wondering if you'd be willing to share more about your personal experience with disability benefits and any way in which there's kind of been like limits in which that's placed on your life.
So I don't have enough bad things to say. And by that, I don't mean that there's nothing bad to say. I mean, I could say endless bad things. No, I'm kidding. It's really frustrating. It's really difficult to get them. I, a lot of people end up hiring specific lawyers that deal with getting disability. If you're if you're suffering from mental illness, to coordinate getting together all your doctor's, information, documenting your inability to work and, putting these things together, and sending them in to, Social Security, um, it's a daunting task. And then if you do get it, you can only have $2,000 in a bank account. So, I mean, it makes it impossible for you to save up to do anything really exciting. Like, someday you might want to, go see Tokyo. Well, that's everybody kind of likes to do a big thing, whether that's, I don't know, whether that's like having a boat and going fishing or going to travel once in a while or whatever it is. But the inability to save up money to do something nice, I mean, I don't know, like it robs you of your humanity, right? Like it's like saying, well, you can limp along and kind of make it through life, you know, and I don't know, sorry, that was a rude thing to say about
Sorry, I think
make it
it's
so
oh,
it makes it so you can't plan ahead. So you can't even save money to, have a down payment on a house or something. I mean, something that isn't, something that's really important like saving to have a car. You can't do any of those things, you know? So it really hinders what you're able to do in your life. It really makes it so it feels like they've helped you, but they don't allow you to have the means to truly set yourself up to flourish,
mm,
you know? Um, and I mean, even, like working, like I I saved up $1,000 in a retirement fund. Um, and I ended up having to pay back a lot of money due to overpayments, like $5,000, because $1,000 in a retirement fund counts against your savings. And I didn't know that. They might have gave me literature that told me that when I was psychotic, when I first started getting disability. I didn't, I couldn't make heads or tails of things. Um, oh, there was another really important point. Oh yeah. If you're $1 over the $2,000, you have to pay back the full amount for the month. So like
oh,
that seems ridiculous to me, Like literally if you had $2,000 and 1 cent, you would have to pay back the full 960 some odd dollars instead of 1 cent overpayment. Um, and the way they do it, it didn't seem consistent. Like in the past, I had never had an issue where I would have money come in on the first and I would pay rent within a couple days. But the last time I ended up getting overpayments that I had to pay back, which I'm paying back now, um, you know, the money came in on the first. I was over the 2000 and then they checked the bank accounts on the first, but you could look at the bank account and see that I immediately, within that day or a couple days paid my rent. So I was down below the 2000 again. And so it was just like, well, like it just felt I'd never had that issue before. And so I wonder if they're consistent. Maybe they are, and I just never was over. But again, it just, there were a lot of details that I wasn't aware of, that, you're told when, you're not doing well and expected to know.
Yeah, that interaction certainly sounds less than helpful. The
Oh,
oh yeah,
also, thankfully, when I've had people like that, um, yeah, they didn't know what they were talking about. It turned out there was no issue, didn't have to report receipts, didn't have to do any of these things. Um, so I don't know where any of that stuff came from, other than it was just like maybe they were just misinformed. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Hopefully it was just that, and hopefully they now, are aware that people don't have to report receipts to it. But still, I can see where that was probably a pretty stressful experience for you to go through. Um, the next question is kind of on the flip side of challenging experiences. Where do you find the most joy? I know in our previous meeting you mentioned, I believe it was poetry, art, and juggling. I'm sure probably among other interests that have influenced your life. And how do those kind of help you obtain, yeah, joy or a state of flow?
I mean, I love poetry. I've wrote poetry. It's kind of funny. I was published in second grade in a poetry book. Um, so I've wrote poetry my whole life. Um, and you know, um, like I love hip hop. For the spontaneous expression of word and rhythmic meter. That state of flow where you're juggling words, and it's really amazing because when you're speaking in those like parameters of poetry, you end up creating meaning that you don't intend to make. When you're just flowing along, you'll say something and there'll be a moment where you're just kind of like, oh, you just kind of appreciate it. And the cool thing like about, freestyling, it's gone. Like you won't remember that in 10 seconds. But it's like you'll say something that's absolutely beautiful, but then it's gone. Um, and I don't know, just finding joy in like the little things. Um, because poetry, you can be sitting there and it's like, okay, I'm gonna put my head over there in that state. Um, it's like a companion that comes along with you. It's a way of looking at the world. Um, and it makes you forget yourself for a bit too, which can be really nice. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. That was, yeah, um, I appreciate that answer. And the last question, um, I think is one that I'm actually especially curious to hear your thoughts on. Is there any advice that you give to others who have schizoaffective disorder, and kind of specifically people with schizoaffective disorder who might be struggling with comparing themselves to others?
um, you know, you know, as someone who's struggled with that, for a while, um, the advice I would give them is finding meaning in your day-to-day life. Um, and it doesn't have to be, these big things, because, from my personal experience, it's like, I had a lot of potential, academically, um, and a lot of people I knew, um, our connection was academics, when we went to school together and things like that. Um, and, those dreams and aspirations, ended up not, being something that I was able to pursue. Um, but, you know, finding meaning in my day-to-day life has been something, that I've been really trying to focus on, more recently. Probably I mean, more now too, but I mean, in the past 3 years, um, really, because for a lot of years, I was really upset with what had happened and out of control doing drugs and, you know, having grandiose thoughts of, oh, I could do this and become a doctor and solve this, or, just trying to compensate my life in some way of like figuring out a grand thing that would make it all okay. And I had a moment, I'm out at the family farm right now. I had a moment at the end of the fall where I was just content, you know? I mean, to such an extent where, I can recall that feeling and I can see the fields, and this was, 2 months, and it was just sitting there and being in that moment. That was really cool. There was a hawk in the barn, um, and it got stuck and it was just flying back and forth in the top rafters of the barn for a whole day. Um, and, I had tried to get it to fly out, the side of the barn. I opened a giant sliding door, and it didn't go out the first day. And the second day, I opened it again, and I actually like called to the hawk to get its attention, and started talking to it, and it stopped flying around. So I was like, that's a good sign. Maybe it realized the door is open because it looked down here and saw that. So I went inside and I went back out, like 4 hours later, and sure enough, the hawk had flown out, the door finally. But I mean, just like that interaction, that was so cool. Like, like I don't know, just something like that was, you know, that's more meaningful to me than, any of these. My life could have been, or that person is that. Like, I helped a hawk, like that hawk would have sat in that barn going back and forth until it was exhausted and died. But I opened the giant sliding side of the barn and I called to it and it saw me and saw the way out. And it's like, you know, I don't know. That's just like, I don't know. Focusing on what's in front of you, because life is amazing. It'll open up to you, if you really, look, there's amazing things that'll happen all the time in ways you have no idea how it would, there's no way you could predict it. But life will just open up. Um, so just look for those opportunities, you know? Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's such a wonderful um, example of your experience with the hawk that you rescued. Um, but more generally, thank you very much for your time and patience with all my questions and for giving such thoughtful answers to them all.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you for hosting this channel and taking the interest to ask me these questions. I really appreciate it.